afternoon. Be better than that. Good afternoon. I am so grateful to be with you all today and to share a little bit of my thoughts. It seems I have come to United during a liminal moment in the school's life. In just my short time here, I've witnessed grief about what was strike folks in unexpected ways. I've witnessed the community work to process and to name their questions and their wonderings. I've seen grief, I've seen frustration, I've seen pain. And I've heard stories, legends almost, of courageous faculty members boldly speaking truth to power. I've heard stories of students shamelessly advocating for themselves, for their classmates, and for their communities. I've heard students share incredible visions of their vocations, attempting to embrace chaplaincy and ministry in unique and cutting-edge ways. I've seen healing, I've seen wild possibility, I've seen hope. In my womanist Christian tradition, we call this liminal space between grief and hope the wilderness. This concept of the wilderness or a wilderness experience is captured beautifully in the Hagar story that we read for today. And I think it's a great story to reflect on as we begin our school year together. In Genesis 16, Hagar, a young Egyptian African slave, serves as the surrogate of Sarai, whose infertility threatens the legacy of her and Abram's family. After what we see in our text as mistreatment by Sarai, a pregnant Hagar flees into the wilderness where she encounters God. The wilderness in the ancient Near East is a desert. It's barren land. There's little water, there's little food, and you are open and vulnerable to all of the natural elements. So Hagar, upset with her reality and how she's treated, upset with the trauma she endures from Sarai, upset with her place in society as a slave, she runs away into the rough and unexpected terrain. It's in this wilderness, in this moment of Hagar's vulnerability, as pregnant, as angry, as alone, where she encounters God and she's asked this monumental question. Hagar, where have you come from and where are you going? Right there in the middle of her anger and her vulnerability, God invites Hagar to do some introspective work. God invites Hagar to name her past of mistreatment, abuse, chaos, and despair, and God simultaneously invites her to name her future, one filled with uncertainty yet with possibility and hope. Womanist theologian Dolores Williams defines the wilderness or wilderness experience as, quote, a near destructive situation in which God gives personal direction to the believer and thereby helps her make a way out of what she thought was no way, end quote. Williams situates Hagar's poverty, her socioeconomic status as a slave, her foreignness as African, and her female body at the center of her problem. Williams suggests that Hagar's experience as an oppressed African woman resonates deeply with African American women today. Like Hagar, African American women experience extreme mistreatment due to their intersectional identities as African and female, and surrogacy practices and forced reproduction during American slavery, and eugenics practices that persisted into the 20th century demonstrate African American women's resonance with Hagar's pain. Hagar in the wilderness symbolism represents faith experiences that shape the lives of African American women. The symbolism bears hope for Black women's collective struggle for survival and liberation in the midst of social, political, and economic oppression. Williams asserts, quote, thus, we can speak of Hagar and many African American women as sisters in the wilderness, struggling for life and by the help of their God, coming to terms with situations that have destructive potential, end quote. Over the past couple years, I've listened to countless stories told by African American women about their mistreatment in the wilderness of the US healthcare system. They shared harrowing stories filled with grief, desperation, chaos, and they also shared about their meeting God along the way. Many described how the divine made a way for them to heal find courage, find spaces of advocacy for themselves and others in the midst of challenging diagnoses and triggering treatment, in the midst of near destruction. As I worked with these women to make meaning out of their lived experience, I worked a confluence of meta-theory and method in womanist and African American psychology and womanist pastoral theology to produce a hermeneutic of womanist psychospirituality. Womanist psychospirituality describes African American women's emotional and cognitive processes of meaning making and healing for both themselves and their communities in light of the psychological, social, and political challenges they face. Both womanist and African American psychologies attest to the integration of psychosocial and spiritual aspects of African American life as contributive to the development of culturally rooted value systems. Meanwhile, womanist pastoral theology examines African American women's use of spirituality to cope, make meaning, and thrive in society. So a womanist psychospirituality interweaves these methods, these theories, and Hagar narratives of the Hebrew Bible to create a hermeneutic that identifies language rooted in African American spiritual values that signals codes for survival and flourishing in systems rooted in American values of oppression. African American women use spirituality to cope and make meaning out of their health experiences, as well as experiences of injustice, such as racism, classism, and sexism. Therefore, engaging stories through a womanist psychospiritual lens elucidates how Black women make meaning out of their mistreatment and maintain their resilience and resistance despite mistreatment. For instance, there was Opal, who went to the hospital to deliver her first child. Her care team, however, was dismissive as her obstetrician switched shifts in the middle of her push. They did not receive consent when beginning certain procedures, and Opal overheard herself being labeled as, oh, just the baby mama, off in the distance. As Opal told me her story of frustration and mistreatment, she easily spoke to God's divine presence and work in the midst of her healthcare journey. She said God knew what to do at that particular moment in time. Opal knew the statistics that African American women are 2 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women, often due to racialized bias on behalf of care providers. So for Opal, God intervened during her wilderness experience and allowed her and her child to survive what could have been a catastrophic event. Opal met God in the wilderness, in that liminal space between grief and hope. Then there's Jamel, who went to her local psychiatric hospital in the midst of a mental health crisis. There, she was criminalized by her care team, and while she was harassed by other patients, her care team looked on with no intervention. Jamel, with a PhD in ethics, challenged her providers when she felt they lacked adherence to her patient rights. But when she did so, laughter was their only response. As she reflected on her clinical encounter, Jamel recalls, I prayed while I was in there, God, please get me out of here. Jamel prayed for the divine to make a way through the wilderness of the psychiatric hospital, and in turn felt called to, in her words, put on her boxing gloves and fight for herself and her rights. Jamel was eventually released. Jamel met God in the wilderness, in that liminal space between grief and hope. And there's Patrice, who called the ambulance to take her to the hospital in the midst of a painful pregnancy loss. Paramedic tasked with relaying Patrice's information to the hospital would ask Patrice, laying in her own pool of blood, what's your pain level out of 10? Patrice would answer, it's out of 10. The paramedic would relay over the phone to his colleague, oh, her pain level is about out of 4. Patrice was forced to advocate for herself and her body, all while she navigated a heartbreaking pregnancy loss and excruciating pain. But it was in that moment where Patrice felt the divine embolden her to trust her body, to speak her truth, and validate her own experiences, even when no one else would. Patrice met God in the wilderness, in that liminal space between grief and hope. And there was Tamika, who went to the hospital because she could not breathe. While admitted, she provided a list of medications that she was allergic to, as this was not Tamika's first encounter with the healthcare system. As Tamika lay in her hospital bed, she becomes dizzy, loses her faculties, and her partner quickly finds her nurse. They further uncover that Tamika was given one of the medications she's allergic to. When the partner confronted the doctor initially lied and accused Tamika of taking illicit substances instead. Tamika describes a divine intervention and that facilitated a shift in her perspective and behavior. She left the hospital that day AMA and searched for more holistic care. In just one chiropractic visit, her breathing issues were alleviated. She credits God and her ancestors for intervening in the midst of her health crisis and enabling her to seek out what she needed, ultimately finding her healing and survival. Tamika met God in the wilderness, in that liminal space between grief and hope. So Hagar runs into the wilderness, where she encounters the divine. And in this story, God demonstrates God's concern for Hagar faring alone in the wilderness. Dolores Williams speculates that God's concern for Hagar and her unborn son may be related to both the high rates of infant mortality in the ancient Near East and with God's concern for Hagar's physical safety. The wilderness can be a rough place with danger lurking around every corner. But the wilderness is also beautiful, sacred. It's in the wilderness where Hagar met God. So God asked Hagar the question, where have you come from and where are you going? Hagar responds with her mission. She's running away from that mistress Sarai. She's running away from the chaos and the mistreatment she endured. She was done with a society that did not value her humanity, nor did they value all that was growing inside of her. It was in this encounter with the divine that Hagar was offered guidance in the midst of her wilderness. And Spirit made a way for Hagar to gain justice for all that she endured by promising Hagar a legacy, a multitude of offspring through her unborn son, Ishmael. See, the idea of an Egyptian slave with her own lineage, with her own legacy, with her own people, was a subversive and radical thought. How could someone with seemingly such little power ascend to being the ancestor of a nation? But yet God promised Hagar that she would birth something spectacular. So I see this text as a testament to the possibility and to the hope that can be birthed out of the wilderness, out of injustice, out of chaos. Just as Hagar ensured her legacy in the midst of her despair, we are at a time in our history here where we can birth something powerful out of the wilderness experience. When we can look back and name who we are and where we've been with boldness and with clarity. We can look forward with courage and with faith to all of the possibilities of beauty and power and courage waiting to be born among us. I know not all of us are womanist Christians, but in my tradition, Spirit is waiting to guide us through the vulnerability of our wilderness into hope and into change. The women I worked with, Opal, Jamel, Patrice, and Tamika, were asked Hagar's question, where have you come from? And they were able to tell their stories of mistreatment and were able to speak to their past experiences of negligence, disrespect, and mistrust. And they were invited, like Hagar, to claim their hope for their future and invited to answer the question, where are you going? As we wrapped up our storytelling, I asked each of them, what do you hope comes from telling your story? What do you hope comes from acknowledging your past and telling the story of when you waded through the wilderness? What do you hope births forth from your words? And they answered. Opal birthed a call for all Black women to ask questions about their health and healthcare, thinking critically about procedures, diagnostics, and even medication. She calls for demanding thorough explanations and securing informed consent. Jamel birthed a call for Black women patients to prepare to fight for the treatment they deserve. She cautions Black women to prepare for resistance as they seek just and safe treatment. Patrice birthed a call for Black women patients to seek care with confidence and self-assurance, trusting, honoring, and communicating their own knowledge and awareness of their bodies. Tamika birthed a call to trust Black women, a call for respect, urgency, and concern, hoping to be treated like a human being by a diverse care team. A spirit asked Opal, Opal, where have you come from and where are you going? Opal may say, I'm coming from grief, but I'm going towards the survival of my legacy. If spirit was to ask Jamel, Jamel, where have you come from and where are you going? Jamel may say, I'm coming from desperation, but I'm going towards justice and knowing my rights. All right now. If spirit was to ask Patrice, Patrice, where have you come from and where are you going? Patrice may say, I'm coming from heartbreak, but I'm going towards speaking my truth. Right now. If spirit was to ask Tamika, Tamika, where have you come from and where are you going? Tamika may say, I'm coming from mistreatment, but I'm going towards self-advocacy and healing. How will we answer Spirit's question so that we can be promised like Hagar, like Opal, like Jamel and Patrice and Tamika, the power of birthing justice, of birthing hope, and of birthing progress as we here embrace our wilderness experience. Amen.